Part 2. Alexander. Chapter 3. The Youth of Alexander. Alexander's father, Philip, was the son of the Macedonian Amyantus, but his mother, Eurydice, was an Illyrian. Perhaps in later life, under the Hellenizing influence of the Macedonian court, she learnt to read and write Greek, in order to give her children a higher education, but by blood she was a pure barbarian, a daughter of the Illyrian prince Eras. Alexander's father consequently was half a barbarian, his mother Olympias, whom Philip made his lawful wife in 357, was the daughter of Neoptolemus, king of the Molossians, whose dynasty was traced back to the son of Achilles, and was therefore looked on as Greek. Though the Molossians themselves, Atrides and Epirus, seem to have been barbarians, and were probably related to the Illyrians. In 356 Olympias, who was about 20 years old, gave birth to Alexander, and next year to his sister Cleopatra. There was no further issue of this marriage, so Alexander was not a pure Macedonian, but had a dash of barbarian blood in his veins. Assuredly, Alexander inherited many qualities of his parents, but this does not entirely explain his individuality. Of his grandparents, who often strongly influenced the grandchildren, we know too little to be able to conjecture anything. Both Philip and Olympias were unusually strong and impulsive in temperament. Philip's acts bears witness to a tireless energy and a strength of will, and to an indomitable pertinacity in following out his secret purposes. His body, covered with scars, showed his bravery and a delight in battle which almost amounted to foolhardiness. These are all qualities which, perhaps even to a higher power, manifest themselves in Alexander. If, on the other hand, Philip is described to us in his private life as an unbridled voluptuary who gave himself up without restraint to the satisfaction of his sensual temperament, those of the contradictory authorities which represent Alexander as of a cool nature in amatory affairs are probably right. At any rate, the love of women never played a leading part in Alexander's life, and he never allowed it to exert any influence on the prosecution of his great ambitions. It was simply to explain this that fictions were told of his love of boys. When he appears as a man of demonic passion, we may to a large extent trace here the inheritance of his mother Olympias, in whom this quality was intensified to the highest degree. But it is part of the wonderful combinations of opposites in Alexander's nature, that by the side of this passion he also exhibits a quite surprisingly cool and calm discretion. Since hereditary alone cannot explain his character, the question what influence education had on him is all the more worthy of interest. Philip, who from the first saw his successor in Alexander, the offspring of Olympias, besides whom he had other wives, devoted himself to his boy's education with great love and care. In the early years, probably through his mother's influence, it was entrusted to a relation of Olympias, Leonidas, who tried to master by severity the uncontrollable and defiant lad. And under him were the pedagogues and elementary teachers, who had to instruct the young prince along with other youths of the Macedonian nobility. When Philip saw that the boy was not to be influenced by force, but only by persuasion, in 343, when Alexander was 13, he summoned Aristotle to be his tutor. This was to have a profound effect on Alexander's development. To understand this lucky choice of Philip, one must not picture the Aristotle of that period as the famous master of science that he has been regarded through the centuries down to our own time. After the death of his master Plato in 347, Aristotle had taught with other Platonists at Assos in the Troad, and had entered into close relations with Hermias, prince of Artanias, who, as mentioned already, was politically connected with Philip. By his marriage with the niece and adopted daughter of Hermias, this connection became still closer. After staying about 3 years at Assos, he then moved to Mytilene in Lesbos and was just opening a school of his own there, when the invitation reached him to educate the heir apparent of Macedonia. Material as these years at Assos were for the development of Aristotle, he was not yet one of the famous great men of the day. His father, Nicomachus, had once been court physician to Amyantus of Macedonia, but this was too remote to have been of decisive weight in Philip's selection. The recent conjecture that the political relations of Philip with Hermias had something to do with his choice has much in its favor. Conversely, it was no doubt tempting to Aristotle to have a hand in the intellectual evolution of the heir to the great Macedonian kingdom, which had become a factor of commanding influence on the fortunes of Greece, and to which belonged his native town, Stagira, that had been conquered and destroyed by Philip. So, at the age of rather more than 40, Aristotle went to Pella to prevent the instruction from being disturbed by the animated life of the court. Philip assigned to him as his residence the quiet little village of Meaza. Here it was that near a sanctuary of the nymphs Aristotle taught Alexander for about 3 years. Perhaps Hephaestion, who was Alexander's dearest friend to his death, was one of those educated with him. It is natural that there was much fiction told about this education and its subjects later, when Aristotle had become the ruler in the intellectual sphere, and Alexander the lord of the actual world. But, unfortunately, we have little information deserving of credit. Details in Alexander's later character may be traced with probability to Aristotle's influence, but the chief result is clear. It was Aristotle who inspired in him a passionate love of Greek culture and made him wholly Greek in intellect. This profoundly affected Alexander's life, naturally in dealing with this boy, whose heart he soon won. Aristotle struck a different note from that of his learned treatises. He was capable of warm feeling, as we see in the deep religious and emotional tone of the hymn to Arete, manly virtue, which he wrote about this time in honor of his friend Hermias, who had been betrayed into the hands of the Persian king, had been tortured at Susa to make him reveal Philip's plans, but had steadily refused to disclose anything and had thereupon been crucified. Deeply moved and exasperated at this, Aristotle raised in his honor a splendid memorial in this dithyrambic hymn to the Arete, for which the heroes had formerly laid down their lives. And now Hermias, whom the Muses would also name as an immortal, with this ideal of manly virtue, which, because of his typical dislike of barbarians, he finds only in Hellas, Aristotle certainly inspired the young prince, and doubtless held before him as patterns the heroes, to whose company was now added his friend Hermias. 2 of the heroes he mentions actually lighted Alexander on his path of conquest, Heracles and Achilles, whom Alexander revered as his ancestors. On his father's side he was the descendant of Heracles, and on his mother's side an Aeacid, sprung from Achilles. If in Alexander's later years, Heracles becomes more prominent, in his earlier days Alexander was inspired by the pattern of the youthful hero Achilles. This deeply rooted and vivid conception of his personal affinity with these heroes is one of those non-rational and instinctive motives, without which we cannot understand him at all. The effects of the Aristotelian training are most unmistakable in Alexander's close connections, even later in Asia, with Greek literature and art, and in his keen interest in scientific problems. It was especially the golden stores of Greek poetry that Aristotle laid before his pupil and enabled him to appreciate. Among the books that formed Alexander's reading later in Asia are mentioned the 3 great tragedians, of whom he knew Euripides best, but he also read the modern authors of the 4th century, like the dithyrambic poets Philoxenus and Telestus, and others as well. In the Theban catastrophe, he showed what reverence he felt for Pindar, the great lyrical poet of the past, but the Iliad was to him the book of books. It certainly also formed the staple of his youthful education. Aristotle actually made a revised edition of it for the benefit of his pupil, which was his constant companion on his Asiatic campaign. How far Aristotle talked to the lad about philosophy, we do not know, though later frictions profess exact information, but he unquestionably roused in him the feeling for philosophic thought. In attendance on Alexander in his camp were philosophers of various schools. Rhetoric can only have been of secondary importance in his education. But certainly Aristotle endeavored to develop political thought in him, to prepare him for his later duties as a ruler, though we have no exact knowledge on the point and are reduced to conjecture. In the political sphere, the 2 men later pursued completely different paths, and could not understand one another. Notably, in the question, what attitude to take to subjected barbarians. Alexander did not follow Aristotle, who was in favor of despotic control. Here, rather, we see him in agreement with the advice with which Isocrates concludes his Philip, that Philip should free the barbarians from barbarian despotism and entrust them to Hellenic care and protection. We may assume as a matter of course that Alexander read this treatise, and it is not impossible that Isocrates, we possess a letter from him to the young prince, written about the time of his instructions by Aristotle. In this sense, had an indirect influence on Alexander. Most notably, Alexander was inspired by Aristotle with a keen interest in natural science. The consequence was that his eastern campaign signalized an epoch-making scientific advance, owing to the investigations and descriptions of Asia, which he ordered from various experts and specialists. This picture of the Earth's surface, which he derived from his teacher, he tested on the spot during his Asiatic expeditions, and enlarged and corrected by his new discoveries. This deliberate promotion of the various scientific branches of study was, however, of less significance in the subsequent history of the world than Alexander's constant desire to introduce into the East the Greek culture, into which he had been initiated by Aristotle. The ideal of Miaza came to an end when in 340 Philip left the boy of 16 as regent at Pella during his campaign against Byzantium. Probably the trusty Antipater was placed by his side, advised him, and introduced him into the practical side of the business of government. That Alexander was really regent is established by the fact that it was he who bore his father's royal seal, and sealed with it the required documents of state. Meanwhile, the Thracian Maidoi rose in rebellion, and it was doubtless a joy to Alexander to have the chance of commanding for the first time in a campaign. Though small, he defeated the enemy, took their town, and, following the example of his father, whose practice was to secure by colonies newly conquered districts, resettled the town, and named it, certainly with his father's permission, Alexandropolis, on the analogy of Philippopolis. This was the first Alexander city. It was to have many successors. What great confidence Philip had come to repose in his son was shown on the decisive day of Caranae, when he gave the prince, then aged 18, the command of the cavalry on the offensive wing. Though tried generals, to be sure, were associated with him, it was an honorable commission, too, to join Antipater in carrying to Athens the ashes of the Athenians who fell in the battle. This was the only time that Alexander ever saw Athens, but the impression this unique city left upon him was indelible. And it was not policy alone that caused him in the earlier period of his reign to single it out for visible distinction. These pleasant relations between father and son came to an end when Philip, soon after his return from the Congress of Corinth, 337, was seized by a passion for a fair Macedonian, Cleopatra, the niece of Attalus, and made her his lawful consort. This implied the repudiation of Olympias, and might even endanger Alexander's claim to the succession. At the marriage feast, there was a terrible scene between Alexander and Attalus, when the latter wished Philip a true-born heir as issue of the new marriage, and a scene still worse between father and son. Alexander and his mother immediately quitted Macedonia. He accompanied her to her home in Epirus, and then went himself to the Illyrians. A surprising step, difficult to explain, but in any case showing how deep was the quarrel. After some time, however, through the mediation of Demaratus of Corinth, who visited Pella as Philip's guest, a reconciliation was effected between father and son, whereupon Alexander returned to Philip. This presupposes that Alexander's fears as to his right of succession were completely allayed. Certainly Philip had never for an instant demurred to it. Once more there was an estrangement between father and son, but it did not go deep and soon passed away. Pixodatus, a Carian ruler and vassal of the great king, had offered Philip a defensive alliance and sought to obtain one of the sons of Philip as husband for his daughter and heiress, as Philip was rightfully of opinion that it was unsuitable for his son and heir to marry the daughter of a Persian vassal. He offered his illegitimate son, Aridaeus, to be Pixodatus's son-in-law. Alexander, misunderstanding this, felt himself slighted, and yielding to the bad advice of his friends, offered himself as son-in-law to Pixodorus, behind his father's back. When Philip learned this act of youthful folly, he explained his motives to his son, and generously pardoned him, but exiled from the court. as a punishment those friends to whom he attributed the chief fault, among them Nearchus, Harpalus, and Ptolemy, the son of Lagus. So father and son were again reconciled, and even Olympias made overtures to Philip, when he proposed to marry their daughter, Cleopatra, to Olympias's brother, Alexander, the Molossian king. It was at the wedding of Aggai, in the midsummer of 336, when Philip was going into the theatre without a bodyguard, that he was stabbed by a certain Pausanias, a young Macedonian noble. The tragic end of Philip is indirectly connected with his alliance with the niece of Attalus, which had already brought so much misfortune on his house. For Pausanias had previously been insulted by Attalus, and, being unable to get satisfaction from him, turned his anger against Philip, who in spite of repeated applications had left the insult unpunished. Though the motive of Pausanias was private revenge, there were others in the plot with him. After all that had passed between Philip and Olympias, the suspicion was bound to arise that she either was privy to the murder, or had instigated it. Her complicity cannot be at all confirmed, natural as it might seem in the case of so vindictive a character. But we must decidedly reject the idea that Alexander was implicated. That is a mere calumny of his enemies. Chapter 4. Alexander's reign down to the war with Persia. In the midst of the intense excitement caused by the murder of Philip and the vast concourse at the magnificent marriage festival at Aggai, the change of monarchs was smoothly effected. The faithful Antipater is said to have helped to quieten the people by addressing them on Alexander's great qualities. The army, which Alexander had led to victory at Carinae, had not the slightest hesitation, and so by the assembly of the Macedonian army, which according to ancient privilege had the deciding voice, Alexander, who was then 20, was at once acclaimed king, and thereby recognized as lawful king of Macedonia. The young king's first thought was to punish the murderers of his father. There are two irreconcilable traditions concerning the fate of Pausanias, one that as he ran away he was immediately caught and killed, the other, which is perhaps to be preferred, that Alexander, who had immediately seated himself on the throne in the royal castle, caused Pausanias to be brought before him, and, as guilty of high treason, handed him over to the judgment of the Macedonian army, whose assembly caused him to be crucified. Later, at the solemn funeral of Philip at Aggai, other persons, regarded as accomplices, were executed in atonement of the crime. Among them were two brothers of the Licentian princely house, Arabius and Heromenes, who were accused of promoting the murder of Philip for the further reason that they wished to win the throne for themselves. It is in favor of this assumption that Alexander pardoned the third brother, the Lyncestian Alexander, because immediately after Philip's murder, he did homage to himself as king and followed him into the palace. Respect for Antipater, to whom this Alexander was son-in-law, may have influenced the young king, but what decided him was that this homage proved that Alexander had nothing to do with his brother's plan of usurpation. His close personal relation to Antipater may have kept him loyal, so he escaped suspicion of a complicity. Alexander would have granted no pardon for this crime, however much he respected Antipater. That such Lyncestian princes might be regarded as possible pretenders is shown by the fact that later Darius promised the third brother Alexander the throne of Macedonia, if he would kill Alexander the Great. The security of the throne required further sacrifices. Amyntas, the son of King Perdiccas, for whom Philip had undertaken the regency, and then put him aside, was still alive, as he was not without a following, and there were many who looked upon him as the lawful successor. He became, after the death of Philip, against whom he had never dared to assert his claim, a danger to the throne of the new king. He was therefore removed, and also Caranus, a half-brother of Alexander, probably by an earlier marriage of Philip, who also might become dangerous as a pretender. Above all, Philip's impolitic union with Cleopatra, the niece of Attalus, had left in her high-born kinsfolk an opposition which might prove a cause for alarm to his son Alexander. Accordingly, before Alexander crossed into Asia, he removed all the male members of this family who could threaten his position. But he was annoyed when Olympias, to satisfy her hatred for her rival, murdered the infant daughter, to which Cleopatra had recently given birth, in the arms of her mother, and forced the mother to commit suicide. The conflicts of the past, for which Alexander was not to blame, caused much bloodshed. His firmness, however, had this effect. As long as he lived, his throne and kingdom were not endangered from Macedonia. The news of the murder of Philip attracted the attention of the whole world, but nowhere did it produce a greater effect than in Greece. It testifies to the diplomatic skill of the young king, that after the murder, at the audience he gave to the Greek ambassadors who had come to Agae for the wedding, he expressed the expectation that the Hellenes would preserve towards him the loyal feeling which had descended to him from his father, thus showing his knowledge that the treaty of the League was perpetual and gave him a legal claim to be hegemon of the League. But in Greece, this interpretation of his rights, though it had been confirmed by oath, was absolutely disregarded as soon as the news of Philip's death arrived. The clauses of the Corinthian treaty were too recent to have already brought about a change in the mentality of the Hellenes. At once, in many parts, Philip's old opponents rose, in the hopes of being able to shake off the Macedonian hegemony. Athens showed the way, and, led by Demosthenes, refused to Alexander the hegemony of the League, in the hope of winning back its own old hegemony over Greece. Under the impression of the defeat at Carinae, Athens had undertaken sensible reforms, designed to strengthen the state, not only in her financial administration, which was reformed by the excellent Lycurgus, but in military matters as well. As in Prussia, universal service followed Jena, so at Athens, after Carinae, the institution of the ephebic system put compulsory service by the citizens on a new footing. At the news of Philip's murder, the people were swept by Demosthenes into an intoxication of liberty. He appeared in the council dressed in white with a wreath on his head. Thank offerings were made to the gods for the joyful news, and honors were paid to the murderer Pausanias. And yet at the marriage festival at Agae, the Athenians had presented a golden wreath and announced a decree, promising to surrender anyone who attempted the life of Philip, if ever he took refuge at Athens. The call to freedom rang out from Athens to the other Hellenes. The Aetolians decided to recall those exiled by Philip. The Ambraciots expelled their Macedonian garrison. The Thebans resolved to liberate their Cadmea. There were disturbances in Peloponnese too, in Argos, Elis, and Arcadia. Even overseas, Demosthenes was in secret communication with Attalus, who along with Parmenio was commander in Asia, and disappointed of his hopes by the accession of Alexander, had become his mortal foe. Subsequently, Alexander had this Attalus put out of the way. When he had proofs of his high treason, Demosthenes also entered once more into relations with the Persian king. On hearing of these inclinations to revolt in Greece, Alexander, although serious reports had been received about the barbaric peoples of the north, put himself immediately at the head of his army and entered Hellas by forced marches, resolved, if need be, to fight for his right. Thus, at the first we find in him that determination and rapidity of action by which later he won his successes. His sudden appearance nipped the revolutionary movement in the bud. The Thessalians, whose country he came to first, not merely elected him archon of their federal state in place of his father, but also declared themselves ready to recognize him as hegemon of the Greek League, and, if necessary, to render him their assistance in punishing Athens on behalf of the League. In his negotiations with the Thessalians, Alexander pointed to their common descent from Achilles and Heracles, and it is interesting to see how from the first this conception of his heroic descent was vivid in his mind, though we must at the same time remember that it is also an instance of the political significance of the myth. He then pressed southwards, and, after winning to his cause the Ioannes, Melians, and Dolopians, occupied Thermopylae, summoned there a meeting of the Amphiotonic Council, and there too received from the assembled representatives of the tribes his recognition as hegemon of the League. Then in still quicker marches he entered Boeotia, and to the terror of the Thebans, pitched his camp near the Cadmea. The rejoicing in Athens died down, and with horror the Athenians realized what a false estimate Demosthenes had formed of the young king, whom he had contemptuously called a simpleton, Margites. who would only go walks in Pella. In righteous wrath, Alexander delivered an ultimatum giving them the choice of war or his recognition as hegemon of the League. The Athenians, who at the news of Alexander's march towards Attica had prepared for fighting, in relief caught at the second alternatives and through their ambassadors asked pardon for not having at once recognized his hegemony. Demosthenes, who was a member of the delegation, conscious of guilt, did not venture to face Alexander, but turned back on Cithaeron. Nevertheless, Alexander was glad to pardon the Athenians. He had had his way, and, at least since his training under Aristotle, he had cherished a secret affection for Athens. The people of Athens thereupon overwhelmed him with honors, even more numerous than those which they had conferred on his father Philip. Alexander then summoned all the members of the League, and especially the Peloponnesians, who had not yet recognized him as hegemon, to send envoys to Corinth, and at the same time convoked a meeting there of the existing representatives. The sole exception of his recognition by the Peloponnese was that of the Spartans, who sent the proud answer that since the days of their forefathers it had been their custom not to follow but themselves to lead others. Afterwards, in the autumn of 336, there was a second constitutive congress at Corinth, at which Alexander renewed the league treaty with the envoys of the states. This time no longer discussions were required, as had been the case 2 years before. For the treaty, with a few formal changes, had only to be altered to the name of Alexander. This treaty also was perpetual, and was extended to the descendants of the king. After Alexander had thus been recognized as hegemon of the League for life, the old council met and entrusted him, like his father before him, with the office of general with unlimited powers for the campaign of revenge against Persia. We may assume that this result of the Congress made a very different impression on the mind of Alexander from that which it had made on his father. To the latter, of designed campaign of vengeance was merely a pretext and an instrument of policy for making Macedonia a great power. But Alexander, into whom Aristotle had instilled a love of Greek culture, was bound to take up the Pan-Hellenic idea with the greatest enthusiasm, as affording him an opportunity to carry Greek culture into Asia. There was also the personal motive, the example of his heroic ancestors, and especially of Achilles. Accordingly, he crossed over to Asia, full of the romantic conception that he, as a second Achilles, was leading the Greeks against the barbarians, but at the same time he went forth as king of Macedonia to conquer new territory. Though we cannot divine his intentions, and though no one can say how far his plans then reached, during the first years of his Asiatic campaign, so long as he was occupied with the Pan-Hellenic ambition, we may yet attribute a twofold aspect to his aims regarding the war. The more passionately Alexander must have yearned for the beginning of his campaign of vengeance, the more must we remark how, after his return from Corinth in the winter of 336-5, he did not prepare to cross into Asia, but, with the deliberation and cool reflections which were characteristic of him in strategic questions, thought it necessary first to settle accounts with the northern barbarians, in order to cover his rear before he left his home. The main trouble was with the Tribellians, a Thracian tribe, living between the Balkans and the Danube, whom Philip had fought but not subjected. Here Alexander's power was, if possible, to be advanced to the Danube, so as to secure for his kingdom a fixed and natural northern frontier. It was this political object which impelled him northwards, not, as has been supposed, the insatiable impulse of a soul hungry for exploits, which would at that time much sooner have sent him to Asia. If this his first campaign, Alexander exhibits the forethought with which he always prepared his military operations. He sent ships of war from Byzantium by way of the Black Sea into the Danube, and ordered them to sail up to a point indicated by him, to cooperate there with his land forces. And if he found them at the right spot, we may infer that he took care to get accurate information about the territory of the enemy. In other respects, too, we find in this Danube campaign as in the following operations of 335 in Illyria and Greece, all the excellencies of his strategy and tactics, which have made him one of the foremost commanders of all time. This deserves to be emphasized all the more, as Parmenio, the trusty old general of his father, to whom there has been a recent unsuccessful attempt to give all the credit of Alexander's success, was then in Asia and took no part in the expedition, nor was Antipater, Philip's other great general, with him, for he had been left behind with a part of the army to secure order in the kingdom and in Hellas. In the spring of 335, Alexander started from Amphipolis. He marched from the Strymon along the coast to the Nestos, Karasu, followed its course inland, turned off by way of Philippopolis, his father's foundation, and reached the Kocha Balkans, where he found the Shipka Pass, occupied by the independent Thracians, who had secured the position behind a fort constructed of wagons. When they tried to break up the phalanx by rolling down wagons, Alexander ordered his men partly to form alleys, through which the wagons hurtled down, and in part to lie down in close formation with their shields over their heads, so that the wagons passed over these roofs of shields without doing any mischief. In this moment of peril, the maneuvers were executed with the calmness and precision of drill on a parade ground, so that not a single man was lost, and we are reminded by this very first encounter that it was the foremost army of the world which Alexander inherited from his father. When the Shipka had been taken by storm, and Alexander had descended into the northern plain, Cyramos, the Trebellian king, with the wives and children of his people, sought safety on an island in the Danube, the position of which it is difficult to identify. Perhaps it was near Nicopolis. The Trebellian army, which withdrew southwards, had suffered an annihilating defeat. 3 days later, when Alexander reached the Danube, he found his fleet, but the banks were so steep that he failed in his attempt to land troops on the island in which Cyramos had taken refuge. The brilliant idea then occurred to Alexander that by a surprising demonstration of force, he would break the enemy's inclination to resist him. He determined suddenly to cross the Danube, put to flight the Gatai, who lived on the opposite bank, and by this demonstration startle Cyramos into surrender. To these political and military motives, a purely personal one was added. Our best authority here uses for the first time an oft-recurring expression, "He was seized by a longing to cross the Danube." This was the non-rational longing for the unknown, the uninvestigated and mysterious, which in his later years took him irresistibly to the ends of the earth, now in his young soul, to which any ideas of world conquest were still foreign. It was this which impelled him to cast a glance upon the unknown and strange world beyond the new frontier of his realm. Quite silently, he prepared for the crossing. The boats used for fishing by the natives were collected, and the canvas of the camp's tents filled with hay to support swimmers. By such primitive methods, and with the help of his fleet, he used the quietness of a dark night to put across the river as many of his troops as possible. Before dawn, there were already 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 infantry on the opposite bank. In the early morning, Alexander led his troops through fields of corn which masked their approach. Then he burst out with the cavalry and dashed upon the Katai, encamped in front of their town. Completely surprised by this almost inconceivably rash feat of Alexander, the Katai, though far superior in numbers, rushed back to the town, hastily snatched up wives and children on their horses, and disappeared into the steppes of the north. Alexander plundered and destroyed the town, offered sacrifice on the north bank to Zeus the Savior, Heracles, and the river god, who had permitted his crossing, and the same day led his army back to the camp on the south bank, without having lost a single man. This almost fabulous expedition had the intended result. Cyramos and his Trebellians made their submission to Alexander. Other neighboring tribes south of the Danube also sent envoys to the king and did him homage. The fame of his deeds reached even the Celts, who had then pushed eastwards from the Adriatic, and they sent an embassy to ask for his friendship. The terror Alexander inspired had a long after effect. It was almost 50 years before the Celts ventured to invade Macedonia and Greece. Alexander's intention was to return to Macedonia by the western route through Paeonia, but near Sofia in the region of the Agrians, a tribe faithful to him, he was surprised by the news that Cleotus, king of Illyria, the modern Albania, had revolted. Straightway he proceeded by forced marches. It was about August, probably by way of Custendil, up the Aragon, Cerna, to the important frontier fortress of Pelion, which commanded the pass from Upper Macedonia into Illyria. It was, however, already in the hands of the enemy. He probably succeeded in driving the Illyrians from the heights and shutting them into the town, but he was prevented from besieging it by the arrival of the Taulantian prince Glaucias, who had joined the rebellion. Alexander had to retreat, and only by a brilliant maneuver escaped being surrounded. Finally, the enemy was defeated by surprise in an open battle, retreated to Pelion, set the town on fire, and escaped. And so, hazardous as the conflicts were, Alexander was again victorious. It was fortunate that he attained his object so quickly. Hardly had he occupied Pelion before the news reached him of a dangerous rising in Greece, which required his immediate intervention. It appears that while Alexander stayed in Macedonia, the Greeks kept quiet, though the parties hostile to him in the cities felt his hegemony as a grievous burden. But when he went northwards and remained a long time in unknown and remote lands, from which no news came, the Greek world was filled with unrest and excitement. Meanwhile, the new king of Persia, Darius III, who had come to the throne in May 336, became aware of the dangers threatening him from the west, for his troops had already come into collision with the Macedonian vanguard in Asia Minor. As he was certainly acquainted with the war resolutions of 337 and 336, and was cognizant of the state of feeling in Greece, he thought he could mostly easily ward off Alexander's attack in the time-honored fashion, by attracting the Greeks to his side with his gold. Accordingly, envoys of the great king invited the various states to revolt from Alexander, and offered large sums as subsidies. Only Sparta, which was not a member of the League, accepted the gold. The states of the League, even Athens, took a correct attitude, adhered to the treaty lately concluded, and refused. Demosthenes, however, had no scruple in accepting 300 talents from the great king for propaganda in the Persian cause. Though his native city had elected Alexander commander-in-chief against Persia, it was a reckless game that he began on his own responsibility, and he bears a great part of the blame for the disaster that fell on Greece. The excitement in Greece, which must have been increased by the Persian proposals, grew the longer Alexander was absent, and reached its maximum when the rumor was circulated that Alexander had fallen in battle with the Trebellians. Demosthenes cleverly used this to promote the agitation, producing in the Athenian ecclesia a wounded man who declared he had been wounded in the same battle in which Alexander fell. The belief in Alexander's death became widespread, and this is of importance in arriving at a legal judgment on the ensuing insurrection. For if Alexander was dead, the Corinthian treaty was null and void in default of any issue of Alexander, and the Greek states had recovered the freedom of action they enjoyed before Chaeronea. So the Thebans, to whom the Macedonian garrison of the Cadmea was an ever-present eyesore, rose at the instigation of the exiles who had been secretly fetched from Athens. They slew some Macedonian officers and began the siege of the citadel, trusting to the support of Athens, which, through Demosthenes, sent them arms that he had acquired with the Persian gold. The Arcadians also rose and dispatched an army to the Isthmus, and would not draw back in spite of a message from Antipater. Aetolia and Elis also began to move. This bad news reached Alexander just when he had finished the struggle for the possession of Pelion. At once he led his army southwards, although it had just been engaged in severe fighting, by forced marches of an average of nearly 20 miles a day. On the 13th day, he who was believed to be dead was already at Onketus in Boeotia, The Thebans thought it could only be Antipater, who had moved against them from Macedonia. And when it was announced that it was Alexander, they thought it could only be the Lancentian Alexander. Perhaps they reasoned that after the death of Alexander the Great, the Lancentian had won the crown of Macedonia. But the next day no doubt was possible. Alexander was before the town. For the correct view of this campaign of Alexander, it is important to notice what has often been overlooked, that he waged it in the capacity of hegemon of the League to punish on behalf of the League its refractory members. This was also the Greek view, for he was hastily joined by small contingents of the neighboring states, who, faithful to him but hostile to Thebes, put themselves under his command in accordance with the treaty. Since Alexander must have learnt that he had been regarded as dead, which completely altered the legal position, he endeavored at first to bring the rebel Thebans back into the League without bloodshed. When he proposed this to them, in case they had thought better of their attitude, they replied by a cavalry attack upon his outpost. Only with the recalcitrance to the living Alexander did the guilt of the Thebans begin. Next day, the king marched round the city and encamped on the south before the Electra Gate, imposing remains of which still exist, where the road from Athens terminates. Here he was nearest to the besieged garrison of the Cadmea, for its southern wall at this point coincided with that of the city. The Thebans had erected a double palisade before the gate, to cut off the garrison from all communication with the outside world. Still, Alexander postponed the attack in the hope of the success of negotiations for peace. But when he promised the Thebans that they should be received back into the League, if they surrendered their ringleaders, they replied with the contemptuous demand that he should surrender to them Antipater and the commander of the Cadmea, and caused a herald to proclaim from a high tower that anyone who wished, in company with them and the great king, to free Greece from the tyranny of Alexander, should forthwith join them. After this, Alexander could not hesitate to draw the sword, and in angry mood ordered the attack. But before he had given the signal, Perdiccas with his regiment rushed forward against the stockade and began the fighting, which developed into a general engagement before the south wall of the city. When the troops which had hurried forward under Perdiccas were put to flight in a sunken road, Alexander with his best troops came into action. In spite of a brave defense, the Thebans were routed, and the Macedonians pressing on after them succeeded in entering the city by the Electra Gate along with the fugitives. Other divisions joined the garrison of the Cadmea and rushed with them down into the city, where the Thebans made one more fruitless stand near the Amphion. There was a terrible massacre of the population, due more to the old hatred of the Boeotians and Phoenicians than to the anger of the Macedonians. What was to be done with the conquered city? As hegemon of the League, Alexander called an extraordinary meeting of the Federal Council, and referred to it the decision of the question, for this decision belonged to the Sanhedrion, not to the hegemon. Only the neighboring allies, chiefly Boeotians and Phoenicians, can have hastily sent their deputies, and so in the meeting the pent-up hatred of the oppressed, who were for many generations had suffered under the supremacy of Thebes, found a irresistible outlet. At this spectacle we are touched by the lamentable disunion of the Greeks, as formerly after the collapse of the Athenian Empire in 404. The Thebans and Corinthians had called for the destruction of Athens, so the deputies now demanded the destruction of Thebes, and no member of the League was found to hinder the execution of the sentence, as Sparta had then done, a fact which should be remembered to her credit. It is true that whereas Sparta had then been able to point to the imperishable merit Athens had acquired in the wars of liberation from Persia, this time the deputies pointed to the treason of which Thebes had been guilty, then as now against Greece. Under the stimulus, the resolution of the League was to level Thebes with the ground, to divide the territory, except that which was sacred, among the Boeotian members of the League, to leave a permanent Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea, to sell the women and children into slavery, and to declare the Theban refugees outlawed from the whole territory of the League. Certainly, if Alexander had wished, he could have tempered the severity of the decree. But in the interest of the pan-Hellenic idea and the campaign of vengeance against Persia, an example had to be made of the rebels, who had deserted the League and played into the hands of the Persian king. So he did not hesitate, as hegemon, to order the execution of the decree. Thus the sacred city, the city of Cadmus and Oedipus, the city of Epaminondas, was wiped off the face of the earth. Yet contemporaries felt that Alexander was troubled by remorse for his behavior. Later, when he had opportunity of showing favor to individual Thebans, he always took it. His order to spare the house of Pindar, the great Theban poet, shows that he did not order the destruction of the city like a raving demon, but under the pressure of political considerations and with divided feelings in his Greek soul. It is also undeniable that he only determined to fight after serious attempts at conciliation. One consequence of this terrible example, which was clearly welcome to him, was that he could without risk pardon all the other rebels. The most surprised by this were the Athenians, conscious of their guilt as the intellectual authors of the Greek rising, when the startling news of the Theban catastrophe fell on them as a thunderbolt during the celebration of the Greek mysteries. They had every reason to expect punishment from the victor, though they had prudently kept back their promised aid and left the Thebans in the lurch. At once they sent an embassy and congratulated the king on his safe return from the north and in his punishment of the Theban rising. This behavior is so contemptible that it can hardly be excused by their deadly terror. It was not until they saw his inclination to mercy that they ventured, on his demand for the surrender of the anti-Macedonian leaders, with Demosthenes as their head, to beg for the withdrawal of the demand by a second embassy headed by Phocion. Alexander, who, quite apart from his love for Athens, felt it important not to drive into the arms of the Persian king, the strongest naval power in Greece, agreed, and was content with the banishment of the general Charidemus, one of his most bitter opponents, who thereupon went off to Persia, accompanied by other irreconcilables.